Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I really haven't made the full case against pre-workouts. I know I've mentioned a few times and given little brief snippets of information about why I am opposed to pre-workouts and why I think they're not only useless but potentially harmful, at least not just to your health necessarily, but at least to your pocketbook and your psychological state as a lifter. I decided to cover this because late last night we were at the gym and I was chatting with a fellow I know who is in his 50s, who is himself a competitive bodybuilder, and he's done a few shows and he's something like 23 days out from a show, and he was discussing his various cardiac issues he's had and heart disease issues, and he was talking about a couple years back he was using some over-the-counter products, a few different ones including a pre-workout, and his niece, who is a nurse, took some of his vitals and told him that he was at a very high risk of a heart attack and he had to get a little bit of coronary work and everything done as a result of that, that his EKG was really messed up, his blood pressure was messed up, and he realized that he was going to have to come off of pre-workouts. And that's something that people don't think about with these products. They're used so commonly that no one really thinks about this aspect of it anymore. But the truth is, these products are very, very strong stimulants, and they have a lot of potential side effects. And to make things even worse, oftentimes the manufacturers, and they've been popped for this many, many times, half a dozen pre-workout manufacturers have been popped for putting illegal amphetamines into pre-workouts. And you know what? I am not a believer in restricting people's access to drug use. I think most drugs should be legalized and far less regulated than they are in a free society with a free market. But that being said, I also believe that a person, if they're buying something, should know what they're getting. And you run into the same problem with these pre-workouts that you do buying drugs on the black market in general illegally. You don't always know what they're putting in the product because the FDA isn't regulating it as closely as they should be, or they're really unregulated. And these supplement companies really push the line on that. So very oftentimes people get amphetamines that they don't know that they're taking. It causes failed drug tests, but also it puts you at potential risk for people who are trying to live a fit and healthy lifestyle. You simply don't know what you're getting. But even if you do know what you're getting, again, you're oftentimes dealing with a combination of substances in these things that are going to ramp up heart rate. They're going to affect the brain. They're going to affect the adrenal glands. And people who are prone to any sort of anxiety disorders, people with any sort of heart issues in their family, these sort of products are potentially dangerous to you, and you should absolutely be avoiding them even if they actually did work. Now, we get onto the issue of, well, do they actually work? And that's a good question, because you see a lot of people who seem to be addicted to these pre-workouts. They take them and then they feel like they can't train without these pre-workouts anymore. And that's a really interesting concept because they become a slave to these pre-workouts. They become addicted. And I meet lots of guys who are like, they go spend $30, $40, maybe even $50 a month on a pre-workout or whichever ones they happen to be using, and we're talking about, again, $500 or $600 a year spent on something. That's not a massive amount of money, but that is still $500 or $600 you could have spent on something else, and people are investing it in their training and their training performance without really questioning if it's helping them or not. And that's the real question that we have to ask, is that what happens if you can't get your pre-workout? It causes psychological distress for people, and for people who want to have flexible training hours, it kind of limits what times a day they can train because they're taking a stimulant that might make it more difficult to sleep or to rest later. And failure to get rest is absolutely going to be detrimental to your training. The stress involved from these substances, because again, they're elevating cortisol levels. And that's not just after training. Elevated cortisol levels post-training have been correlated pretty strongly with increased muscle growth. But elevated cortisol throughout the day, how about several hours after you train if you take these products? That's not necessarily helping you recover. It's not helping you grow. That's a potential detriment. But then there's also the stress component of when people can't get a hold of their pre-workout or they forget to take their pre-workout. They get stressed about it. They get upset about it. They feel less motivated to train. Well, being stressed and being less motivated to train is the last thing you want if you're trying to make gains. That's a real problem. So what ends up happening is these substances become a crutch that people feel that they need to train because they become so reliant upon it. And here's the thing that we have to consider. Let's factor in, do they actually help? Because everyone's like, well, they help me push things to the bleeding edge. They help me train longer. They help me train harder. Well, that's not always a good thing. If that's not a accompanied by additional recovery like you get from certain other substances out there, training longer and training harder may not actually stimulate very much additional muscle growth. It might give you a little bit of additional, maybe 5% more on the stimulation end. And I'm not going to argue that. Pushing out extended sets, training to failure through multiple sets, training for an extra 20 minutes, 30 minutes hard before you get really fatigued and the weights start going down. Sure, that might give you 5% more muscle growth stimulation through extra metabolic fatigue. However, all of those things also have a recovery component. And if it reduces your recovery and how often you can train again, for example, if you push yourself so hard with these pre-workouts or whatever it is you're using that your recovery takes at least 3 days for any given muscle group, beyond the 3-day mark, and you can't train again for longer than 3 days, so you're stuck breaking them up at least 4 days out, you are absolutely losing muscle growth unless you're on hefty amounts of drugs, because we know that muscle protein synthesis and muscle growth never lasts beyond that. It's generally 2 days at the very most that you're going to grow from a workout. So you should be recovered within 3 and be able to train within 72 hours, at least the same body parts, lifts, muscle groups, things like that. And if you're pushing yourself so hard that you can't train them again with similar workloads again in that time frame, or at least reasonable workloads that could stimulate adaptation, then you are actually losing growth. So what ends up happening, for example, on your squats or whatever, if you're taking these pre-workouts and training a leg day or something like that, and you can't train them again for 4 or 5 days due to soreness, fatigue, your peripheral nervous system being too fatigued, then you are absolutely losing gains. You're more than losing that additional 4 or 5% you might have stimulated in the gym with the extra drive. So the loss of recovery and the effect on the peripheral nervous system, because you're taking a stimulant that ramps up your adrenal glands, it ramps up the peripheral nervous system. Well, the nervous system can take longer to recover than muscles sometimes, and if you're overstimulating these things, and again, you can't train the same lift again for 4 days, 5 days, 7 days, because you fatigue the nervous system and you can't handle the same sort of workloads or weights that you previously had done, you're losing progress. You're losing gain as a result of this substance. So that's the thing that people aren't factoring in. They think that, well, this lets me train just a little harder and push things to the next level, but at the expense of recovery and reduced training frequency. That is absolutely never going to allow you to gain additional muscle mass to be in that situation. It will always impede your progress slightly, unless you're on hefty amounts of far more anabolic substances and some sort of cocktail, because that will allow that sort of scenario to work for someone to gain more muscle, because they don't need as frequent of training, and that additional workload and volume could stimulate additional growth. But for people who are completely clean, completely drug-free lifters who are very mild users, that is not a situation that you want to find yourself in, to where you're stuck training a given lift or body part that far apart again due to peripheral nervous system fatigue. Yeah, you're absolutely going to lose progress from that. So that's the problem we run into with these pre-workouts, is that they might make you feel like you're able to push a little more in the gym, but if it's impeding your overall recovery and ability to train reasonably hard again at a longer time period, you are losing progress from taking this product. So what may actually be happening with all of this is that you might be spending $500 or $600 a year on a product that at the end of the day is reducing your quality of life, because it's elevating your stress levels, your cortisol levels. It's reducing your potential gains due to a negative impact on your recovery that's going to affect training frequency. And it's something that you can become psychologically addicted to. So this is not an ideal situation to be spending money on something that you're psychologically addicted to, that is reducing your quality of life in other areas because of the elevated stress, reducing your gains, which is the whole reason you were going to the gym in the first place. And you're shelling out $500 a year on it when you could have spent that money on something that is actually enriching or improving your life in some way. Because that's the whole point of all of this. Every single one of you train for one reason or another. We all have our own motivations for training. Some of us have 5 or 6 different reasons, and it doesn't matter whether it's just to feel better about yourself and your self-esteem, or thinking it's going to attract girls, or because you're actually a serious competitor in something. We all do this to improve our quality of life. And it seems to me, when you look at the total cumulative effect both financial, psychological, physical of these pre-workouts, they're doing the exact opposite. They're actually slightly reducing quality of life, and in some cases ruining people's quality of life if they're failing drug tests or whatever because of the illegal amphetamines that are slipped into them sometimes. So I am not a fan of pre-workouts. I don't generally advocate their use, and I would recommend for most of you that you toss them away and give them up and kind of just detox yourself off of them. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.